from the records of the life of Reverend John Murray, written in 1816.
John wrote, "The water was smooth and our passage pleasant until we were, as we supposed, near Sandy Hook. A dense fog then arose which was sufficiently thick to prevent our seeing the end of our bowsprit. A sloop shot past us, and we inquired how far we were from Sandy Hook. The answer was 70 miles, but we understood 7. And we passed on, and in a few moments we were in the midst of the breakers. The vessel struck upon the bar, but passed over into a place we afterwards learned was called Cranberry Inlet. The fog now dispersed, and we discovered we were nearly on shore. Our anchors, however, saved us. But we were greatly alarmed and never expected to get off again."
With the boat stuck, John and the others on board headed to land to find food and lodging. John finds his way to Thomas Potter's house. Potter supplies him and others on the boat with food to eat in the town tavern, and he encourages Murray to return to his house after dinner, where he can settle for the night. John agrees, and when he arrives at Potter's door that evening, he is greeted by Potter, who says,
"Come, my friend, I am glad you have returned. I have longed for you. I have been expecting you for a long time."
I was perfectly amazed. What do you mean, sir?
Potter explains how he, a self-described poor, ignorant man, found his way to the land he now occupied. He created a sawmill, and he had a sloop, and created a large estate. Grateful for his good fortune, he pledges to open his house to strangers, especially traveling ministers, along his way. He would have conversations with the preachers, but he found himself dissatisfied by their theology. He believed God would send him a preacher who
shall deliver unto me his own truth, who shall speak of Jesus Christ as salvation."
Potter hosted Baptists and Quakers and Presbyterians, and still he waited. Then,
"The moment I beheld your vessel on shore, it seemed as if a voice had audibly sounded in my ear. 'There, Potter, in that vessel, cast away on that shore, is the preacher you have been so long expecting.' I heard the voice, and I believed the report. And when you came to my door and asked for fish, the same voice seemed to repeat, 'Potter, this is the man, this is the person whom I have sent to preach in your house.'"
But, my dear sir, you are deceived. Indeed, you are deceived. I shall never preach in this place or anywhere else.
"Have you never preached? Can you say you have never preached?"
I cannot, but I never intend to preach again.
"Has not God lifted you up the light of his countenance upon you? Has he not shown you the truth?"
I trust he has.
"Well, how dare you hide his truth? Do men light a candle to put it under a bushel? If God has shown you his salvation, why should you not show it to your fellow men? But I know that you will. I am sure God Almighty has sent you to us for this purpose. I am not deceived. I am sure I am not deceived."
I was terrified as this man went on, and I began to fear that God, who orders things according to the counsel of his own will, had ordained that thus it should be, and my heart trembled at the idea.
Murray, you see, had left his preaching life behind him in England. He had suffered many losses, and he came to the shore of this country with a heavy heart.
"The wind will never change, sir, until you have delivered to us in that meeting house a message from God."
Still, I was resolutely determined never to enter any pulpit as a preacher. Yet, being rendered truly unhappy, I begged I might be shown to my bed. He requested I would pray with them if I had no objection. I asked, how could he suppose that I had any objection to praying? The Quakers, he said, seldom prayed, and there were others who visited him who are not in the habit of praying.
"I never propose prayer. lest it should not meet with the approbation of those with whom I sojourn. But I'm always pleased when prayer is proposed to me.
I prayed, and my heart was greatly enlarged and softened. When we parted for the night, my kind host solemnly requested that I would think of what he said. Alas, he need not have made this request. It was impossible to banish it from my mind. When I entered my chamber and shut the door, I burst into tears. I would have given the world that I had never left England. I felt as if the hand of God was in the events which had brought me to this place, and I prayed most ardently that God would assist and direct me by his counsel. I present myself before him as a man bound down by calamity, a melancholy, outcast, driven by the repeated afflictions of body and of mind to seek refuge in private life, to seek solitude amid the wilds of America. Thou knowest, said my oppressed spirit, thou knowest, O Lord, that if it had pleased thee, I would have preferred death as the safest and most sure retreat. But thou hast not seen fit to indulge my wishes in this respect. In thy providence thou hast brought me into this new world. Thou seest how I am oppressed by solicitations to speak unto the people the words of life. Thou knowest that I am not sufficient for these things. To thee, O thou compassionate Father of my spirit, encouraged by thy gracious promises, I make application. Pity, oh pity the destitute stranger. Leave me not, I must earnestly entreat thee to my own direction. Thus did I pray. Thus did I weep through the greater part of the night, dreading more than death, even supposing death an object of dread, the thought of engaging as a public character.
Murray continued to toss and turn, struggling with God, knowing that if he did indeed preach,
the clergy of all denominations would unite to oppose me. My mind continued subjected to the most torturing reflections. I could not bring myself to yield to the entreaties of Mr. Potter, and still I urged the necessity of departing the moment the wind would answer. Mr. Potter was positive the wind would not change until I had spoken to the people. Most ardently did I desire to escape the importunities of this good man. The idea of a crowd making a public exhibition of myself was, to my desolate, woe-worn mind, intolerable, and the suspense in which I was held was perfectly agonizing. I could not forbear acknowledging an uncommon coincidence of circumstances, the hopes and fear of this honest man so long in operation, yet he evinced great warmth of disposition and was evidently tinctured with enthusiasm, but after making every allowance for these propensities, it could not be denied that an overruling power seemed to operate in an unusual and remarkable manner. I could not forbear looking back upon the mistakes made during our passage, even to the coming in this particular inlet, where no vessel the size of the brig Hand in Hand had ever before entered. Every circumstance contributed to bring me to this house. Mr. Potter's address on seeing me, his assurance that he knew I was on board the vessel when he saw her at a distance, all these considerations pressed a powerful conviction on my mind, and I was ready to say, if God Almighty has in his providence so ordered events as to bring me into this country for the purpose of making manifest the savor of his name and bringing many to the knowledge of truth, though I would infinitely prefer death to entering into character, which will subject me to what is infinitely worse than death. Yet, as the issues of life and death are not under my direction, am I not bound to submit to the dispensation of providence? I determined to take the changing of the wind for an answer, and had the wind changed, it would have borne on its wings full conviction, because it would have corresponded with my wishes. But the wind changed not, and Saturday morning arrived.
Well, now, let me give notice to my neighbors.
No, sir, not yet. Should the wind change by the middle of the afternoon, I must depart. My tongue can tell, no tongue can tell, no heart conceive how much I suffered this afternoon. But the evening came on, and it was necessary I should determine. and at last, with much fear and trembling, I yielded a reluctant consent. Mr. Potter then immediately dispatched his servants on horseback to spread the intelligence far and wide.
Potter had built a meeting house 10 years before Murray arrived. Murray entered the meeting house and preached with Potter looking on with eyes sparkling with pleasures. After Murray preached, he returned to Potter's home.
Now I am willing to depart. Oh my God, I will praise thee. Thou hast granted me my desire. After this truth I have been seeking, but have never found it until now. I knew that God, who put in my heart to build a house for worship, would send a servant of his own to proclaim his own gospel. I knew he would. I knew the time would come. When I saw the vessel grounded, I knew you were the man. When I saw you approach my door, and my heart leapt for joy.
Visitors poured into the house, and he took each by hand.
This is the happiest day of my life. Their neighbors is the minister God promised to send to me.
I ran from the company and, prostrating myself before the throne of grace, besought my God to take me and do with me whatever he pleased. If thou in thy providence hast brought me into this new world to make known unto this people the grace and the blessings of the new covenant, be it so, O Father, for it seemeth good in thy sight. Immediately upon my return to the company, my boatman entered the house. The wind is fair, he said. Well then, we will depart.
I heard the version of this Potter story in our Unitarian Universalist curriculum, Tapestry of Faith. I've watched religious education teachers sit on the ground with young children and use felt images of Potter and Murray and tell the story of the ship called Hand in Hand and Murray's arrival at Potter's farm, which was known by the name of Good Luck. Having been enamored by so many stories in the Christian gospel as a young child, I could see the children responding equally to this tale. This story is often referred to as our UU miracle story. Certainly, the two men involved in it spoke of it that way. Their meeting is described as divine providence. I pulled Murray's writing about his 1770 meeting with Potter because to hear it in his words helps us to understand the thoughts and the faith of the two men. It demonstrates their relationship with God and their belief in the importance of universalism being brought to the people in America. They're all the right parts of this story. Potter building a meeting house that feels similar to Noah building an ark. Murray wrestling with God like Jacob wrestling with the angel in the book of Genesis. Murray's plea to reject this call to preach faith on the American soil, just as so many of the prophets of the Bible originally responded to their calls. Murray was fleeing his past, which included the death of his young wife, their one-year-old son, as well as 3 sisters and a brother. Coupled with this unimaginable grief, there was the reality of falling into debt and being rejected by family members and colleagues who opposed his universalist theological perspective. He even had a short stint in prison prior to leaving England. Quite frankly, as you heard in his words, he wrestled with whether he should even go on living. That fateful day when he preached in Potter's meeting house was the beginning of a ministry in America that spread universalism in New England and the East Coast. Across the pond, James Relly, a Methodist minister who shifted to universalism, formulated his ideas and published them in a book called Union, or a treatise of the consanguinity and affinity between Christ and his church. Originally, Murray was not a fan of Relly, but after an encounter with one of his followers, he became an enthusiast. Relly went against the Calvinistic claim that humans need the threat of eternal punishment in order to be moral beings, and about divine selection. A short paragraph describing Relly, published by the UU Church of Bloomington, Indiana, says, Relly believed in a loving God who would not allow humans to suffer eternal punishment. If humans were steeped in original sin, then they shouldn't be blamed for their failings. If humans learned to do harm to others, they could also learn how to redeem themselves through good works. He preached his doctrine of universal salvation, which his critics called Rellyism in England, and later no-hellism in the colonies. Yes, this question of salvation, who is saved and who is not, was one of the cornerstones of different Christian beliefs of the time. The God of love that Universalists believed in would never condemn one of his beings to damnation. The logical progression of that belief is that if no one's being damned, then there must be no hell. Murray also rejected infant baptism, and our current day child dedication ritual is rooted in his creation of an alternative to baptism. He rejected transubstantiation. I'm so terrible with that word. Thank God I don't have to say it often, which is the idea that the bread and wine is changed into the body and blood of Christ through the sacrament of communion. He held communion as a memorial to Christ's suffering. Instead of Christ's body being a part of the ritual, his communion recognized the enactment of the Last Supper and the promise of going to heaven. Murray arrived in America in 1770, which was a period of religious growth. Just a few decades earlier sparked what was referred to as the Great Awakening, which spanned across the English-speaking world. There was a growing wave of evangelicalism with Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists, while other faiths like ours were far behind in terms of numbers. I guess that's still true. Relly's theology was seen as a counter to the predominant viewpoint in the English and in the American religious landscape. And his book, Union, it found the way to the shores of America before Murray's arrival. But Murray, with his commitment to itinerant preaching versus staying put in one church for much of his career, he helped spread universalism. His theology wasn't welcomed in many parts of the country. He was often forced to preach in public spaces because ministers wouldn't let him share the pulpit. There was a legendary story of him preaching in Boston in 1774, 4 years after his arrival. As he preached, stones were lobbed through the windows, and one rock, rather large, landed awfully close to him. If it had hit him, it could have taken him out. But without missing a beat, Murray leaned down and he picked up the stone and he said, "This argument is solid and weighty, but neither reasonable or convincing." Over and over again, he chose not to debase his opponents, and his kindness helped him create friendships with people beyond the religious sphere. It's noted that he was quite influential compared to other Universalist ministers of his time. He met George and Martha Washington on a train trip, and they hit it off. They remained friends. He was part of a selected delegation to greet Washington when he took command of the Continental Army in Cambridge in 1775. He also served as a chaplain in the Revolutionary War, and later he was called to a prominent pulpit in the heart of Boston and is sometimes referred to as the Bishop of Universalism. As you recall, Unitarianism and Universalism were separate streams of faith until 1961. Murray wasn't ordained by a denomination, and he had no formal religious training despite the condemnation he received from mainstream religious leaders. He still held fast to that calling. He was actually instrumental in starting the Universalist Church of America, which was the Universalist organizing body that started in 1793. Murray was connected to other notable impact in the early lives of our faith and religious life. The congregation he served in Gloucester, Massachusetts, was the first to challenge the practice of forced taxation on local churches. Murray's congregation built a church and they wanted to use the taxes to support their own church. They challenged the constitutionality with Murray as the plaintiff in the case. What would happen is that folks who lived in a certain area had to give taxes to the predominant church in that area. This was an early victory for the separation of church and state, and it happened several years before the Dedham case, which is the one that we all study in seminary as the predominant story in Unitarian Universalism. Let's be clear, though, that the state in this case was really representing the predominant Christian institutions. So at stake here was not just a case about taxation, but also a struggle related to morality and Christianity. A blog called American Creation includes quotes from the court's documents. Murray's opponents stated, "We beg leave to ask, can a man who publicly disregards the doctrines of God's moral government, of future rewards and punishments, urge with any good faith or with any hope of success the practice of morality? Can he consistently preach up morality when at the same time he saps its very foundation and cuts the nerve of Christian piety by blending all the characters together and by making all equally holy because he equally united to Christ in his carnation?" In reply, the Universalist said, whether he is a teacher of piety, religion, and morality cannot be determined by the revision of motives as he offers as the rewards and punishments which are to be bestowed or inflicted in another world. We believe that the question must be decided by the evidence of his urging to the people to piety and morality as the foundation of the greatest good from which our natures are capable of, and as compliance with the Almighty Creator and Preserver, without going into inquiry of his opinion respecting the quality of punishment or the future of the state. A lot of words, but basically they're fighting over whether humans can be pious without this sort of negative punishment of God. So this was really the first protection of religious freedom by the highest judicial tribunal in the Commonwealth. And the verdict of an impartial jury, the Universalist of Gloucester, won and went on fearlessly, rejoicing that it fell their lots to resist the beginning of oppression under the new Constitution and to test, at such an early period, its liberal provision in favor of the freest toleration. Many of you were at a conversation several years ago when we were discussing the name of our church. As people reflected on including this mostly unknown Unitarian martyr Michael Servetus in our name, people spoke to the irrelevance of the debates of the 13th through the 19th century religion compared to what our current Unitarian Universalist theology and philosophy offer folks. I tend to agree, but I know that the roots of this faith are important. The forefathers and the foremothers who are willing to separate from mainstream religious movements, often at great risk, in order to spread the good news of God's love and to challenge the status quo, are important for us to know. One of the challenges of this faith is that we lack a consistently used text that many religions rely on. Some you use turn to the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas and the Upanishad. I can never say it right. Never mind, to name a few. But most of us lean on our principles and our wisdom from a range of the 7 sources and the 7 principles as our guidance for spirituality and meaning. Personally, I really like that we have a miracle story, a fated meeting that marks the beginning of an open and loving faith that shifted people's idea of God, salvation, and what was the predominant religion. We come from a history of seekers who aren't afraid to grapple with sacred texts to find their own theology, seekers that accentuated the good in humans and our commitment to the web of life that spans from other beings to the planet Earth and beyond. May we be worthy of such history and to continue to carry on in that spirit. May it be so, and amen. So I'm curious about you guys, whether you have heard this story and whether it grounds you in any way in our faith, or whether there's other stories that sort of come to mind as I speak of Potter and Murray that are stories you hold on to in our faith tradition that help inspire your faith and connect you to this history. Chad has a microphone here, and Diana's there. I don't know how many of you are, I know some of you are really quite steeped in Unitarian and Universalist stories and history.
I've not heard this story before, but I need to pay attention because separation of church and state is really dear to me, as is changing the name of our church. So you have my attention, but I still need to know more.
I see Marilyn Raveling raising her hand online. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Oops. Okay, this is Marilyn. So the opposite side of that name issue, one of the things that I hold very strongly after hearing that Michael Servetus' story is that he was murdered, burnt at the stake because of his beliefs, because of his desire to share the Bible with the common folk. And the other thing is, I haven't memorized all the principles, but I do go to the ones that I can remember. And also the song that we sing at the end of every service. And they just tie me down to a more balanced world. And I love that.
Thanks, Marilyn.
I see Lynn's hand.
I actually have a question. Do we know what happened to Mr. Potter's meeting house? Did he bring in other preachers, or did Murray ever go back to that, or was that just a one-time event?
I do believe he went back as in an itinerant, but I don't actually know whether Potter ever arranged to have a permanent person at that meeting house. It's a great question, Lynn. Unfortunately, Potter's kind of left in the dust with the story of Murray progressing.
This is
Kathy
Katie.
Ford. Oh, go ahead, Katie.
And this is a little bit tangential. It's just that I was thinking the other day just about kind of the sources and that we don't have our own canon. We have a canon, but anyway, I was just with MLK Day. I was just thinking that, you know, really reading through all of those speeches or listening to them might actually be a very enlightening source of source.
To go back to the original text, you're saying.
Right, and not just get all of the sound bites that we tend to hear from MLK, but to really read and understand the depth of what he was saying.
I love that. I love that
interesting.
idea. Was it last year or the year before we read was it the Constitution online? And it was so interesting to really study that and reflect on what that primary text was. We were doing it a little bit around manifest destiny was part of why we were reading the Constitution. But Katie, I love that idea. And I think, you know, to hear it in the original voices is so different than to hear the summarized story through the lens of somebody else who's decided to summarize it that way.
Kathy Forbes typed a comment into chat saying that creating fear, like the fear of hell, is a method of control. It's like fear in the workplace or in politics.
Thanks, Kathy.
I'm not seeing any other hands online. Let me just check. There are 2 pages worth of people, so I have to scan you all to make sure I don't miss you. I don't see anyone. If I have missed you, please go ahead and unmute and speak.
Thanks for everybody for sharing. Our closing hymn is 145, As Tranquil Streams. The story behind the hymn is that it was written in 1933 by Marilyn Franklin in advance of the hymnal that was shared by the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church in America. The song was originally written to celebrate the growing relationship between the streams of the two denominations, who were finding it useful to work together. As the final votes were cast in 1961 for the merger, and a new Unitarian Universalist Association was formed, it's said that the assembly sang this hymn together. Just like before, we'll have the hymn leaders up here at the mic. People at home will be muted and can sing along, and those of us who are here, let's hum together. Hum the hymn.